So the question is, why is 9/11 truth so important now, 15 years later? A lot of people will say, well, that was a long time ago, it was 15 years ago, it's all over, they're dead, they're buried, and Osama bin Laden's been killed. So what difference does it make? Well, it's very much like the 9/11, like the John F. Kennedy murder. Why does the murder of John F. Kennedy still matter today, 53 years later? Well, the murder of Kennedy matters because it was a coup d'etat. And the powers behind the assassination took control of the government and orchestrated the cover-up. The man raising his hand being one of the main cover-uppers. And a coup d'etat that is kept secret in a democratic country means that the succeeding government is illegitimate. U.S. military involvement in Vietnam spanned a period of 2 decades, from 55 to 75. But of course, it spiked after the murder of John F. Kennedy, because John F. Kennedy wanted to actually pull the troops out of Vietnam. The Kennedy assassination matters because the U.S. government continues to support the lies of the Warren Commission, mainly that one man did it, Lee Harvey Oswald, and that there was no conspiracy behind his actions. The Kennedy assassination matters because the mainstream media continues to support and even endorse the official version. The Kennedy assassination matters because when the government supports the lies about the murder of the president, it means that the powers that killed President Kennedy are still in charge to this very day. Of course, the American people have historically been of the opinion that there were others involved, that there was a conspiracy behind the murder of Kennedy. So, why does 9/11 truth matter? Here we are almost 15 years later. For all the same reasons, of course. 9/11 truth matters because the government continues to lie about what happened to this very day. These two men being of course, the administrations since 9/11. And 9/11 was a policy coup that brought us the war on terror and a series of costly wars. Actually, the war on terror brought us 9/11, but I'll get to that. 9/11 truth matters because for 15 years, the controlled media has pushed a false story, a false narrative about 9/11 and the war on terror, all the while suppressing evidence that disproves the official myth. Now, this is a quotation from Dr. Alan Sabrosky, who was the director of studies at the U.S. Army War College. And in 2009, this scholar from the U.S. Army War College came out and validated my thesis with his writings. And he wrote this in 2009 in an article called Treason, Betrayal, and Deceit, 9/11 and Beyond. He said, the evidential trail for 9/11 and the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq runs from PNAC, AIPAC and their cohorts through the mostly Jewish neocons in the Bush administration and back to the Israeli government. He said none of the denials and political machinations can alter that essential reality. And the mastermind, or the architect, the man behind the war on terror, the most outspoken advocate of this doctrine, is this man in the foreground here. His name is Bibi Netanyahu. He's the current Prime Minister of Israel. He's the head of the Likud party since 1993. The other man is Ehud Olmert, and Ehud Olmert is a former Prime Minister. They're both in the Likud party, which is the party of terrorists. And it's interesting that Ehud Olmert was in New York City on September 11th, but his presence in New York City was kept out of the newspapers. 10 days later, he came back to New York and acted like the older brother of Giuliani. New York City and Jerusalem are, in fact, sister cities. And at the time, he was the mayor of Jerusalem. So he came to basically, support Giuliani and give him advice. But the question is, if he was there on September 10th and September 11th, why has that been kept secret? What was he doing in New York City on September 11th and September 10th? And why was that kept away from the American people? This is the former Israeli Prime Minister, also Ehud Barak. He's also former Israeli Chief of Staff. And on September 11th, he was in the London studio of the BBC World, which is the largest English-speaking broadcast network in the world. And he was, before the towers even fell, he gave his analysis of what we were experiencing. The towers had been struck, but they had not yet fallen. And he said that the world will never be the same from today on. He says, we know who's behind this. This is Osama bin Laden. And we know where Osama bin Laden is. He went on to conclude, now it's time to launch an operational, concrete war against terror. And that is the basic Zionist analysis of what happened on 9/11. And that has been the myth ever since. Now, what's Ehud Barak's relationship to Netanyahu? Well, they were both in a secret elite commando force called the Sayeret Matkal. And when Netanyahu was in this commando force, his commando leader was Ehud Barak. And they did operations together, for example, the Entebbe hijacking. And that was the hijacking where Netanyahu's brother was killed. And this commando force that they belong to is called an independent covert commando force because it serves directly under the Israeli chief of staff and military intelligence. On 9/11, the New York Times put out this edition, and in the first headline you see there are basically 3 untruths. Hijack jets, destroy Twin Towers, and hit Pentagon in Day of Terror. First, there's no indication that a hijacked jet hit the Pentagon. There's also no indication that the planes were hijacked. The planes were rather drones. And thirdly, the planes did not destroy the World Trade Center. Explosives did. So it's a very complex and a very sophisticated crime that we're trying to wrap our heads around. And Larry Johnson, who was the director of counterterrorism at the State Department, said about 9/11, he said, "We don't have anything in history to compare with this. The only thing that comes close to it is a former Soviet intelligence operation." Some people will say, Mr. Bolin, you're being anti-Semitic, you're blaming Israel for attacking America. Israel is our strategic ally, our special friend. They would never attack the United States. I would refer them to this incident in the Six-Day War in 1967 on June 8th, when Israeli military planes and ships bombed and attacked and tried to sink the USS Liberty. They killed 34 Americans, injured 171. This was an American spy ship in international waters off the coast of Egypt. And Israel, the Israeli military, knew it was an American ship and told the pilots, sink it with all hands lost. So when the Americans put life rafts into the water, the Israeli military boats, gunships, machine gunned the life rafts. So that the intention was that the ship should go to the bottom of the sea and all lives would be lost. But they failed. The ship was an old World War II ship that stayed afloat. But it's been a suppressed part of our history. It's not talked about. It's not taught in schools. You won't find out about it on television. 9/11 is very much like the murder of John F. Kennedy. And these are some quotes from a JFK researcher. He's talking about the JFK assassination, but these quotes are exactly appropriate as for 9/11 as well. Primarily, all the time it was obvious, it was blatantly obvious, that it was a conspiracy. And secondly, the cover story was transparent and designed not to hold, to fall apart at the slightest scrutiny. And that's the 9/11 cover story. If you look at the 9/11 story, what the government tells you, you can pick it apart piece by piece. It comes apart at the seams immediately. This is a photograph, of course, of the pulverization of the 110 floors of one tower. And basically, we're looking at a situation where the towers were cooked to a very high temperature with this molten metal. It's full of the molten metal is found in all the dust. The people inside were being cooked above the crash zones, and then the towers were exploded. And everything that was on those floors, everything was pulverized. Another interesting thing, I'll be pointing out some of the connections between some of the key players in the 9/11 saga here. And these are two of the most key players. It's Bibi Netanyahu on the left, obviously, and on the right is Larry Silverstein. Larry Silverstein is the person who owned basically all 3 buildings that fell that day. He had a 99-year lease on Towers 1 and 2, North Tower and South Tower, and he owned outright Building 7. Now, this is from an Israeli article from November of 2001, and they're talking about the fact that these men had a very, very close relationship. For years, Netanyahu and Silverstein have kept in close touch. Every Sunday afternoon, New York time, Netanyahu would call Silverstein. It made no difference where Netanyahu was, he would always call. Their ties continued after Netanyahu became prime minister in 1996. Now, how did Larry Silverstein become the owner of these publicly owned towers? The World Trade Center the towers belonged to the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, a public facility. And the way it went was like this. Ronald Lauder, this man here, he's the son of Estee Lauder. He's very closely tied to Israeli intelligence. There's a school named the Lauder School of Government, which he funds at the Mossad's University in Herzliya. And he was made the director of Governor Pataki's privatization scheme in the year 2000, late 1990s. And he decided that they would privatize the World Trade Center and other places like Stewart Air Force Base, the former Stewart Air Force Base. That's important because both planes converged over Stewart Airport, the privately owned Stewart Airport, on their way to the towers, which is very appropriate, I mean, very much like the Operation Northwoods plan, that the planes actually landed someplace and their flight paths were continued by drone aircraft, a la Operation Northwoods. So after Mr. Ronald Lauder decided to privatize the World Trade Center, it then went to, the dossier then went to the head of the Port Authority, the man at the top right. His name is Lou Eisenberg. And Lou Eisenberg became then the person who would oversee the negotiations that led to Larry Silverstein getting the buildings. Now, Larry Silverstein did not have the wherewithal to really buy the World Trade Center. He put down $100 million of borrowed money from GMAC, which was being run by a friend of his. They gave him $100 million to put down, and that was the down payment. And after some very convoluted negotiations, the buildings, the World Trade Center, went to Larry Silverstein. So on July 24th, 2001, about 5 weeks before the towers fell, Larry Silverstein got the keys. And he said on that day, he said, I'm proud to assume the stewardship of the World Trade Center, one of New York's greatest jewels. 6 weeks later, this is what New York's jewels looked like, a pile of rubble. And the people that dealt with this pile of rubble said that all that was left of the World Trade Center was steel and dust. That's it.